A lone boy, scarred by loss, wanders the brutal frontier of Dust Creek in 1875, where survival demands a cold heart. 11-year-old Caleb Harlow, orphaned by a merciless ambush, clutches his mother's swallow-shaped hairpin, his only tie to a family stolen by fire and blood. Shunned and starving, he seeks refuge in the haunted Red Hills, unaware that one act of mercy will forge an extraordinary destiny. Can a single choice transform enemies into kin? Subscribe now to uncover Caleb's journey from outcast to hero, and share where you're joining us from in the comments below. What secrets lie in a warrior's beads? Stick around. His tale of courage might just change everything. Dust Creek's autumn wind howled like a coyote caught in a steel trap, kicking up gunpowder-scented dust that stung Caleb Harlow's eyes. The year was 1875, and the frontier town sprawled beneath a bruised sky, its wooden storefronts leaning like weary drunks after a bar fight. At 11, Caleb was a ghost among the living, his boots scuffing the cracked boardwalk as he dodged hard stares from passers-by. 2 years ago, his parents' wagon train had burned to ash under a mercenary's torch, leaving him with nothing but a name and a swallow-shaped hairpin tucked in his pocket, its silver edges worn smooth by his restless fingers. Folks called him lucky for surviving, but in Dust Creek, luck was just a slower kind of dying. He slunk past the saloon, where piano notes clashed with the clink of whiskey glasses and the growl of men betting their last dime. Caleb's stomach twisted, hollow as the wind, whistling through the town's gaps. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's stale bread crust, swiped from a horse trough when no one was looking. His patched shirt hung loose on his scrawny frame, the cuffs frayed from nights curled up in haylofts. To the townsfolk, he was a stray dog, useful for fetching nails or sweeping porches, invisible otherwise. They saw him as a reminder of cholera outbreaks and ambushes, of things best buried in the red dirt. Hank Miller's general store loomed ahead, its windows glowing with a warmth Caleb would never feel. He lingered in the back alley, where a barrel of bruised apples sat, their skins blotched like a plague victim's. Hunger gnawed harder than pride, so he reached for one, brushing off the rot. The sour tang hit his tongue as he crouched behind a stack of crates, out of sight. Through the store's grimy window, he watched families, mothers fussing over bolts of calico, kids tugging at their skirts, fathers bartering for tobacco and bullets. Normal things. Safe things. Things Caleb hadn't known since the night fire swallowed his world. "Get away, you filthy rat!" Hank Miller's voice cracked like a bullwhip from the doorway. The storekeeper's face was red as raw beef, his eyes narrowing at Caleb's shadow. "Touch my stock again, and I'll tan your hide in the square." Caleb clutched the apple core, its juice sticky on his chin, and scrambled back. He hadn't stolen yet. But truth didn't matter when you were nobody. Miller's boots stomped closer, and Caleb ducked behind a rain barrel, heart pounding like a war drum. He held his breath, shallow and sharp, until the man's curses faded into the store's creaking floorboards. Survival meant staying small, staying silent, letting the world forget you existed. The Red Hills called to him, their jagged outlines cutting the horizon like a broken blade. Kids whispered of ghosts out there, native spirits, vengeful and faceless, haunting the scrublands, where no sane settler wandered alone. Caleb didn't care. The hills promised solitude, a place where the wind didn't carry insults and the ground didn't bruise. He slipped past the town's edge, where the last fence post sagged under years of neglect, and followed a deer trail into the wild. Sagebrush scratched his shins, and the air turned sharp with the scent of pine and red earth. Here, he could breathe without glancing over his shoulder. Here, he could pretend he was a scout, not a scavenger, mapping unclaimed lands instead of dodging kicks. His fingers brushed the hairpin in his pocket, its swallow shape a tether to a mother who'd sung him to sleep before bullets and blades took her. The memory cut deep, but it was all he had. Proof he'd once been more than Dust Creek's outcast. He climbed a low ridge, the hills stretching before him like a sea of rust and shadow. Somewhere out there, beyond the sage and stone, he could almost believe his parents waited, ready to pull him into arms that smelled of wood smoke and love. But the West didn't deal in dreams. It dealt in blood and grit, and Caleb had learned that lesson the hard way. He scanned the hills, his pulse quickening at a faint sound, a low, pained groan from a rocky hollow below. Curiosity, that old devil, tugged at him, whispering of secrets darker than his loneliness, waiting to be uncovered. Caleb froze on the ridge, the faint groan from the rocky hollow below, slicing through the red hill's silence like a knife through hide. The sound was human, raw, and heavy with pain, pulling him toward it as surely as a lasso snags a stray calf. Dust Creek's warnings echoed in his mind, tales of vengeful spirits and scalp-hunting natives. But the West had already taken everything from him. What was one more risk? The year was 1875, and the hill's rust-colored shadows stretched long under a blood-red sunset, daring him to step into their secrets. He eased down the slope, boots crunching on loose gravel, each step deliberate to avoid snapping twigs that could betray him to whatever lurked below. The air grew thick with the scent of sage, and something sharper, blood, metallic and fresh. Caleb's pulse hammered, urging him to bolt back to the safety of Dust Creek's scorn, where a whispered word about a native in these hills could earn him a hot meal. But the groan came again, weaker now, like a man's last breath clinging to life. Curiosity, that reckless spark, held him fast, stronger than hunger or fear. The hollow opened before him, a jagged scar in the earth framed by gnarled junipers. There, slumped against a boulder, was a man in a deerskin tunic, his chest heaving under a sheen of sweat and blood. A broken spear, its shaft carved with swirling patterns, jutted from his shoulder, the wound oozing dark down his side. A gash on his hip, long and cruel, suggested a blade meant to kill slowly. Beside him, a string of swallow-shaped beads glinted in the fading light, their curves mirroring the hairpin in Caleb's pocket. His breath hitched. Every tale he'd heard screamed danger. Natives were raiders, the reason rifles stayed loaded. Yet this man, broken and bleeding, looked less like a monster and more like a soul teetering on the grave's edge. Caleb's mind raced. Running to town meant a posse by dawn, this man's body left for crows. But the beads held him rooted, whispering of a mother's touch, of a life beyond Dust Creek's hate. He dropped to his knees, hands trembling as he gripped the spear's shaft. The wood was slick with blood, warm under his fingers. He yanked hard, the warrior's body jerking with a sickening squelch as the spearhead came free. A low moan escaped the man's lips, his chest shuddering. Caleb's heart thudded. He'd just crossed a line no orphan could uncross. He scrambled to a nearby rock hollow where rainwater pooled from last night's storm. Dipping his hands, he dribbled the cool liquid over the shoulder wound, washing away grit and blood. The warrior's skin was gray as ash, his face etched with pain even in unconsciousness. Caleb tore his only shirt into strips, the fabric ripping like a snapped promise. He pressed the cloth tight against the shoulder, blood seeping through instantly, staining his fingers red. The hip wound was shallower but vicious, a blade's cruel signature. He bound it as best he could, his small hand steady despite the fear clawing his gut. Every rustle in the brush made him flinch, expecting a rifle's glint or a mercenary's laugh. The warrior stirred, eyes fluttering open, dark and sharp as a hawk's. Caleb froze, braced for a cry that would bring death running. Instead, the man's gaze locked on him, searching, as if reading the boy's soul. "Crow Lance," he rasped, voice like gravel under a boot. "Son of Black Hawk." Caleb's mouth went dry. Black Hawk was a name whispered in Dust Creek with fear and scorn. A Red Elk chief who'd bloodied the railroad's hired guns. Crow Lance's hand twitched toward the swallow beads, fingers brushing them with a reverence that made Caleb's chest ache. "Why?" Crow Lance croaked, his English halting but clear. Caleb didn't have an answer that made sense in a world where mercy was a fool's bet. "You were hurt," he mumbled, eyes on the ground. "Couldn't walk away." The warrior's stare softened, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face before his eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling him under. Caleb scanned the hollow. The trail to Dust Creek was too close, and dusk brought hunters. He needed to move Crow Lance, but the man was twice his size, heavy with muscle and blood loss. Gritting his teeth, Caleb hooked his arms under the warrior's shoulders, dragging him toward a crevice he'd found months back during a sandstorm, a narrow slit in the rock hidden by junipers. Each step burned his arms, blood smearing his hands, leaving a trail he'd have to erase. The crevice's darkness swallowed them, its damp stone walls a fragile shield against a world that dealt in death. The crevice's damp stone walls closed around Caleb Harlow and Crow Lance like a grave, the air thick with the tang of blood and earth. The year was 1875, and the Red Hills stood silent under a moonless sky, their jagged peaks slicing into the stars. Caleb crouched beside the warrior, his hands still slick with blood from dragging him to this hidden slit. Each labored breath from Crow Lance was a reminder of the line he'd crossed, a white boy saving a native in a world that thrived on hate. The swallow beads at the warrior's side glinted faintly, tying Caleb to a choice that could cost him everything. He worked fast, his small frame taut with urgency. The makeshift bandages, torn from his shirt, were already soaked crimson, useless against the steady seep from Crow Lance's shoulder. Caleb's eyes darted to the crevice's mouth, where dusk's fading light cast long shadows. Hunters roamed these hills, and the blood trail he'd left dragging Crow Lance here was a map for anyone with a nose for trouble. He grabbed a handful of dry juniper needles, scattering them over the smeared red stains outside, praying the wind would scatter the scent. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what he'd done. Mercy in a land that dealt in bullets. Crow Lance's breathing hitched, a ragged sound that pulled Caleb back. The warrior's face was gray, his lips cracked like drought, parched earth. Caleb fumbled for the rainwater he'd scooped into a tin cup scavenged from a miner's camp last spring. He tilted it to Crow Lance's mouth, the water spilling over the man's chin, mixing with blood and dirt. "Stay with me," Caleb whispered, his voice barely louder than the wind hissing through the junipers. He didn't know if the warrior heard, but the words were more for himself, a tether to keep panic at bay. He tore more strips from his shirt, now little more than rags, and re-wrapped the shoulder wound, pressing hard to slow the bleeding. The hip gash, though shallower, wept red with every twitch of Crow Lance's body. Caleb's hands moved with a steadiness he didn't feel, each knot tied with the precision of a boy who'd learned to mend his own boots with twine. The West didn't forgive mistakes, and neither would the men who'd hunt them if they found this crevice. He glanced at the swallow hairpin in his pocket, its edges biting his palm, grounding him. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, soft, urging kindness even when the world spat in your face. A distant coyote's yowl cut through the silence, and Caleb's heart lurched. He crawled to the crevice's edge, peering into the darkening hills. The trail to Dust Creek was a half-hour's run, but going back meant facing Hank Miller's fists. Or worse, A posse eager to string up a native and anyone fool enough to help him. Caleb's stomach growled, a hollow ache that matched the emptiness in his chest. He hadn't eaten since that bruised apple, and hunger was a cruel companion, sharpening his fear. But leaving Crow Lance to die felt like betraying the hairpin, the last piece of a life where he'd been more than a shadow. He returned to the warrior, checking the bandages again. Crow Lance's eyes flickered, half open, glinting like obsidian in the dim light. "Boy," he rasped, voice rough as gravel. "You risk death." Caleb swallowed, his throat dry as the sagebrush outside. "Ain't got much to lose," he muttered, avoiding the warrior's gaze. Crow Lance's hand twitched toward the swallow beads, fingers brushing them as if they held the weight of a lost world. Caleb understood that touch, the way a small thing could anchor you when everything else was gone. He needed to keep Crow Lance alive through the night. The crevice was cold, the air sharp with the scent of pine and stone. Caleb gathered dry brush from the crevice's corners, piling it to cushion the warrior's back, careful not to jostle the wounds. He found a flat rock, using it to scrape dirt over the bloodstains inside, masking their presence. Every sound, the skitter of a lizard, the creak of a branch, set his nerves ablaze. He didn't know if Crow Lance's people would come, or if mercenaries were already tracking the blood. All he knew was the crevice wasn't safe forever. Dawn would bring new dangers, and Caleb's choice to save a stranger had set him on a path with no way back. Dawn's first light crept into the crevice, painting the damp stone walls in shades of ash and blood. The year was 1875, and Caleb Harlow sat vigilant beside Crow Lance, the Red Hills' silence heavy as a loaded rifle. The warrior's shallow breaths steadied, but each one was a gamble against death's patient hand. Caleb's choice to save him had locked them in this hidden slit, a fragile refuge from a world that would kill them both for what they'd done. The blood trail was covered, the bandages retied, but safety was a lie in a land where trust was scarcer than water. Caleb slipped out at first light, his boots silent on the dew-slick earth as he darted toward Dust Creek. The town slept, its saloons quiet, its streets littered with the ghosts of last night's brawls. He crept behind the livery stable, where a crate of moldy potatoes sat forgotten. His fingers, still crusted with Crow Lance's blood, plucked two that weren't fully rotted, then snagged a strip of jerky from a drying line. A dog's low growl froze him, heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. Discovery meant questions, and questions meant a noose for the man in the crevice. He melted into the sagebrush, stolen food tucked against his chest, and retraced his steps, stepping on stone to hide his tracks. Back in the crevice, Crow Lance was awake, his dark eyes clearer but shadowed by pain. Caleb knelt, offering the potatoes and jerky. The warrior took them with a nod, his calloused fingers brushing Caleb's. "You risk much, boy," he said, voice low as gravel stirred by a slow wind. Caleb shrugged, chewing a bitter potato skin. Risk was nothing new. Every day in Dust Creek was a dance between starvation and a beating. But something in Crow Lance's gaze, sharp yet weary, stirred a spark of connection, like a flint striking steel in the dark. Their words came slow, pieced together from Crow Lance's halting English and Caleb's gestures. The warrior spoke of the Red Elk, his tribe, pushed to the edge of their hunting grounds by the railroad's iron claws. He told of Keene, a disgraced sheriff turned mercenary, whose men ambushed him to break Black Hawk's resistance. The name Keene hit Caleb like a bullet. He'd seen that man's face in the firelight the night his parents' wagon burned, his laugh echoing as the mercenaries slaughtered all but one. Caleb's fingers tightened around the swallow hairpin, its edges biting his palm. "Keene's men," he whispered, voice raw. "They killed my ma and pa." Crow Lance's gaze sharpened, reading the boy's pain like tracks in the dirt. He leaned back, hand resting on the swallow beads. "My wife," he said, voice heavy as iron. "She wore these. Soldiers took her and my boy in a raid. Burned our lodge." The words hung between them, a bridge of shared scars. Caleb's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. For the first time, he saw not just a warrior, but a man who'd lost as much as he had. Maybe more. If this tale's gripping you, like it's got us, hit that subscribe button to ride along for the rest of Caleb's journey. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you'll want to see where these hills lead. They fell into a rhythm, silent but steady. Caleb foraged what he could: wild onions, a handful of berries, water from a nearby seep, while Crow Lance taught him to move quieter, stepping on stone to leave no trace. The warrior's strength crept back, though he winced with every shift, his wounds far from healed. By the second day, they shared more than food. Caleb spoke of his mother's songs, soft as prairie wind, and his father's knack for whittling toys from cedar scraps. Crow Lance recounted Red Elk tales, of stars guiding hunters home, of spirits in the hills that judged a man's heart. Their stories wove a fragile thread, tying orphan to warrior in a world that thrived on division. But the crevice's safety was thinning like a worn saddle. Hoofbeats echoed in the distance, faint but growing. Likely hunters, or worse, Keen's men sniffing for blood. Caleb's pulse quickened as he scattered dirt over the faint bloodstains from their first night. Crow Lance watched, jaw tight, and pointed to a narrow ledge deeper in the crevice. "Hide there if they come," he said. "My people will find me soon. They track better than wolves." Caleb nodded, but fear gnawed at him. The Red Elk might save their kin, but a white boy in their path was as good as dead. The swallow beads caught the light, and Caleb wondered if his mercy had bought him a home or a grave. The swallow beads glinted in the crevice's dim light, a fragile hope against the gnawing fear that Caleb's mercy might lead to a grave. The year was 1875, and the Red Hills dawn broke cold, the air sharp with pine, and the threat of hoofbeats drawing closer. Caleb's eyes flicked to Crow Lance, whose jaw tightened at the distant sound, his words about his people tracking like wolves, now a promise, or a peril, hanging heavy between them. Before Caleb could speak, shadows moved at the crevice's mouth, swift and silent, and the glint of rifle barrels turned his blood to ice. 3 Red Elk warriors emerged from the sagebrush, their moccasins noiseless on the rocky ground, faces painted with black and ochre stripes that blended with the hill's rust-colored scars. The leader, a man with a scarred cheek and eyes hard as flint, barked a command in a tongue Caleb didn't know, his rifle snapping up to point at the boy's chest. Caleb's hands raised, trembling, still crusted with Crow Lance's blood. The other 2 warriors fanned out, their bows taut, arrows nocked, ready to pin him to the stone. Fear clawed his gut, but he stood frozen, knowing one wrong move would end him. Crow Lance struggled to sit, his wounded shoulder oozing fresh red through the bandages, his voice cut through the tension, sharp despite his pain, speaking rapidly in their language. He gestured to Caleb, then to the swallow beads at his side, his wife's keepsake, his movements fierce as he placed himself between the boy and the barrels. The scarred warrior's eyes narrowed, flicking to the beads, then to Caleb's blood-stained hands. His rifle lowered an inch, but distrust still burned in his gaze, like a spark waiting for dry tinder. He spat a question, venom clear even without translation, and Crow Lance answered, his tone unyielding, pointing to the crevice's blood-smeared floor as proof of Caleb's mercy. The warriors hesitated, their weapons half raised, caught between duty and doubt. Caleb's heart pounded like a war drum, his mind racing with images of Dust Creek's posse, of Keene's men, of a noose tightening around his neck for aiding an enemy. The scarred warrior stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Caleb's small frame. He grabbed the boy's wrist, twisting it to inspect the bloodstains, then released it with a grunt. Crow Lance spoke again, weaker now, his hand clutching the beads, as if they could anchor his fading strength. The warriors exchanged glances, and the scarred one nodded, sharp and reluctant, motioning for the others to lower their weapons. They bound Crow Lance to a stretcher of branches and hide, their hands quick but careful, avoiding his wounds. The scarred warrior barked an order, and Caleb felt a rough hand shove him forward, out of the crevice. The Red Hills canyon stretched before them, their red walls glowing under the rising sun like embers of a dying fire. The warriors moved like ghosts, their steps leaving no trace on the parched earth. Caleb stumbled to keep pace, his boots clumsy against their silent tread, his eyes darting to the scarred warrior's rifle, still close enough to end him. The trail wound through a maze of sage and stone, the canyons narrowing until the sky was a thin blue scar above. Crow Lance swayed on the stretcher, his fevered eyes meeting Caleb's, a silent vow that kept the boy moving. The warriors spoke little, their words clipped and guttural, but Caleb caught his name, sharp amidst the unfamiliar syllables. The scarred warrior's gaze flickered to him, less hostile now, tinged with something like curiosity. Caleb tried to mimic their steps, placing his feet on stone to avoid soft earth, earning a subtle nod from the youngest warrior, whose bow hung slack at his side. The journey stretched on, each step a gamble, the camp still hours away. Dust Creek's scorn was behind him, but the Red Elk's judgment loomed ahead, as unforgiving as the desert sun. The canyons twisted like the veins of some ancient beast, their walls closing in as the trail dipped toward a fast-running stream. Smoke curled in the distance, thin as a whisper, marking the Red Elk camp. Caleb's pulse quickened, the swallow hairpin biting into his palm as he clutched it in his pocket. He was a white boy in a place no settler belonged, walking among men who'd sooner gut him than trust him. The warriors' rifles glinted with menace, and every rustle in the brush felt like a sentence waiting to fall. Blackhawk's name hung over them, a storm cloud ready to break, and Caleb knew his next steps would decide if he'd find a home or a noose. Blackhawk's name hung over Caleb Harlow like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of judgment as the Red Elk camp came into view. The year was 1875, and the canyon's red walls parted to reveal a scattering of hide lodges nestled against a swift stream, their smoke curling thin as a dying whisper. Caleb's boots scraped the rocky trail, flanked by warriors whose rifles glinted like fangs in the midday sun. Crow Lance swayed on his stretcher, his fevered gaze steady on Caleb, a silent anchor amidst the tribe's looming verdict. Every step felt like a march to a gallows only the hills could see. The camp buzzed with life, then fell silent as the warriors approached. Children froze mid-chase, their laughter snuffed out like a candle in a gale. Women paused over grinding stones, hands stilling, while men gripped axes and bows, their eyes hard as the canyon stone. Caleb's heart thudded, pinned by 100 stares sharper than any blade. He clutched the swallow hairpin in his pocket, its edges biting his palm, grounding him against the urge to bolt. The scarred warrior shoved him forward, and he stumbled into the camp's heart, a lone figure in a sea of painted faces. A woman with gray-streaked braids rushed to Crow Lance's stretcher, her hands tracing his wounds with a mother's fear. Her eyes, wet with tears, snapped to Caleb, a storm of grief and suspicion. "You," she said, her English clipped but sharp. "White boy who saved my nephew." "Why?" The question was a challenge, not a plea, and the tribe's silence pressed heavier than the desert heat. Caleb swallowed, throat dry as sagebrush. He was dying, he said, voice steady despite the rifle still half raised. I know what it's like to lose everything. Couldn't let it happen again. The woman's gaze flicked to the swallow beads at Crow Lance's side, then back to Caleb, searching for deceit in his dirt-streaked face. She spoke rapidly in her tongue, and the warriors stirred, some nodding, others muttering with hands tight on their weapons. Crow Lance struggled to speak, his voice weak but firm, gesturing to Caleb's blood-stained hands as proof of his deed. The debate grew heated, voices clashing like steel in a saloon brawl. Caleb stood frozen, a scrawny boy under the weight of a tribe's judgment, each word a rope tightening or loosening around his fate. A shadow moved at the camp's edge, parting the crowd like a river splits around a boulder. Blackhawk stepped forward, tall and silver-haired, his presence heavy as thunder rolling over the plains. His eyes, dark as a storm's heart, locked on Caleb, stripping the boy bare. "You saved my son," he said, voice low and resonant, carrying over the camp like a prairie wind. "But your people take our land, our blood. Speak, boy. Why should we believe you?" The question hung like a noose, and Caleb's pulse raced, knowing his words would decide if he walked free or bled into the canyon dust. He met Blackhawk's gaze, the hairpin's bite in his palm steadying him. "I ain't them," he said, fists clenched. "I'm just a kid who's got nothing left but what's right. I saved him 'cause leaving him to die felt like spitting on my ma's memory." A warrior snorted, but others leaned closer, their suspicion cracking like dry earth under rain. The woman with gray braids stepped forward, her face unyielding but her voice softer. "Your people burn our homes, steal our rivers. Why's your heart different?" Caleb's throat tightened, memories of his parents' screams flashing like lightning. "'Cause I know loss," he said, voice raw. "I know hate. But I couldn't let him die alone." The camp stirred, murmurs rippling like wind through sagebrush. Blackhawk's eyes held Caleb's, searching for a lie that wasn't there. Crow Lance raised a trembling hand, pointing to the beads, his voice a rasp. "He is no enemy," he said, each word a fight against pain. The tribe's tension hung taut, a bowstring ready to snap. Caleb stood tall, though his knees shook, feeling the weight of every eye, every rifle, every scar earned in a war he hadn't started. The stream's rush and the distant cry of a hawk were the only sounds, as if the hills themselves waited for Blackhawk's verdict. Then, a shout from the camp's eastern edge shattered the silence, a frantic cloud of dust rising with the crack of gunfire, pulling all eyes from Caleb to a new threat thundering closer. The crack of gunfire from the camp's eastern edge shattered the Red Elk's tense silence, a storm breaking over Caleb Harlow's trial. The year was 1875, and the Red Hills canyons flared red under the midday sun, their walls echoing with the chaos of an ambush. Blackhawk's eyes, dark as a tempest's heart, flicked from Caleb to the rising dust, his verdict unfinished. Caleb's pulse hammered, the swallow hairpin biting his palm as he stood frozen, a boy caught between a tribe's judgment and a new threat thundering closer. A young scout, face streaked with black war paint, sprinted into the camp shouting, "Keen's men! They're hitting the fields!" Warriors grabbed rifles and bows, moving like hawks diving for prey, their moccasins kicking up red dirt as they rushed to defensive posts. Women herded children toward the lodges, their faces taut with fear. Crow Lance, pale on his stretcher, gripped his father's arm, whispering fiercely in their tongue. Caleb's eyes darted to the western tree line, where shadows moved, too quiet, too deliberate. His gut twisted. He'd seen this trick before, the night his family's wagon burned. Keen's mercenaries were splitting their forces, the eastern attack a decoy to draw the warriors away. The camp's heart lay exposed, only a handful of warriors remaining to guard Crow Lance and Caleb. Black Hawk barked orders, his silver hair whipping as he rallied his men. Caleb's gaze locked on the junipers, where glints of steel betrayed 5 mercenaries creeping closer, their faces hard as flint, blades catching the firelight. They aimed for Crow Lance, a strike to break the tribe's spirit. Caleb's breath caught. He knew their plan, had heard it in Keen's laugh as flames devoured his world. Without thinking, he bolted toward Black Hawk, dodging a warrior's grab. "West side!" he shouted, voice cracking like a snapped branch. "They're coming for him!" Black Hawk spun, his eyes narrowing as he followed Caleb's point. The warriors pivoted, arrows nocked, rifles raised. Caleb scrambled to the stretcher, snatching the broken spear shaft he'd pulled from Crow Lance's shoulder, its jagged end heavy in his hands. The mercenaries burst from the trees, guns drawn, their boots churning the earth. A shot grazed Black Hawk's shoulder, blood blooming dark on his tunic, but he stood unbowed, shouting commands that sent arrows flying. Caleb's heart pounded, his eyes catching a 6th mercenary circling behind, pistol aimed at the chief's back. Instinct took over. Caleb swung the spear shaft, its splintered edge cracking against the mercenary's wrist. The gun clattered to the dirt, the man howling as he clutched his hand. A Red Elk warrior loosed an arrow, swift and silent, dropping the mercenary where he stood. The skirmish erupted, steel clashing, gunfire splitting the air like thunder. Caleb ducked behind the stretcher, gripping the spear shaft, his knuckles white. The Red Elk fought with a ferocity that matched the canyon's unyielding stone, their arrows finding throats, their knives carving through leather and flesh. The mercenaries fell back, 3 dead, the others fleeing into the junipers, their curses swallowed by the wind. The camp's drums began to pound, a deep rhythm echoing like a heartbeat across the red earth. Caleb's chest heaved, the spear shaft still clutched tight, its tip stained with the mercenary's blood. Black Hawk turned, his wounded shoulder bleeding but his stance steady, his eyes locking on Caleb with a weight heavier than the rifles around them. The warriors returned from the eastern fields, faces etched with triumph and exhaustion, their rifles still warm from the fight. Crow Lance struggled to sit, his fevered gaze meeting Caleb's, a nod of gratitude passing between them. The woman with gray braids stood nearby, her eyes softer now, tracing the boy's dirt-streaked face, as if seeing him anew. The camp settled, but the air remained charged, the stream's rush mingling with the drum's pulse. Caleb felt the tribe's stares, no longer all venom, some tinged with respect, others still wary. He'd acted without thought, driven by the same spark that had him save Crow Lance, a refusal to let loss win again. Black Hawk stepped closer, his shadow falling over Caleb like a storm's edge. The chief's silence was a blade, sharp and testing, as the warriors formed a loose circle, their painted scars glinting in the firelight. Caleb's hand tightened on the hairpin, its swallow shape a quiet vow to the mother he'd lost. The camp waited, the drums steady, for Black Hawk to speak, to decide if this boy's courage had earned him a place among them or a traitor's end. Black Hawk's silence hung over the Red Elk camp like a blade, its edge testing Caleb Harlow's fate as the drums pulsed steady as a heartbeat. The year was 1875, and the Red Hills Canyon stood sentinel, their red walls glowing under the fading sun, bearing witness to a boy who'd fought for strangers against his own kind. Caleb stood, scrawny and dirt-streaked, the swallow hairpin biting his palm, his heart pounding under the chief's unyielding gaze. The warriors' circle tightened, their scarred faces and weathered rifles a wall of judgment, waiting for Black Hawk to decide if courage could outweigh blood. The chief's shoulder bled, a dark stain spreading from the mercenary's grazing shot, but his stance remained unbowed, a mountain against the prairie wind. He raised a hand, and the drums fell silent, the camp holding its breath. "This boy," Black Hawk said, his voice rolling like thunder over the stream's rush. Saved my son when he could have run. He warned us when he could have stayed silent. He fought for us when his own would call him traitor. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, held Caleb's, seeing through to the bone. He is no outsider. He is Red Elk. A murmur rippled through the warriors, like sagebrush bending under a gust. Caleb's chest tightened, his breath shallow, half expecting the words to be a trick, a prelude to a blade. Crow Lance rose from his stretcher, shaky but defiant, his wounds still weeping red. He stepped forward, the swallow beads glinting at his side, and lifted them with trembling hands. The camp watched, still as stone, as he draped the beads over Caleb's head, their cool weight settling against the boy's skin. "Crow Little Wing," Crow Lance said, voice rough but sure. "My brother." The words landed heavy, a vow forged in blood and fire. The warriors knelt, row after row, their heads bowed like junipers under a storm. Nearly 200 men, their painted scars and rifles gleaming in the firelight, honored a boy who'd been nothing in Dust Creek's eyes. Caleb's eyes stung, tears he hadn't shed since the night his world burned, threatening to spill. The woman with gray braids stepped closer, her face no longer a storm, but a quiet dawn, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "You carry loss like us," she said, her English soft but clear. "Now you carry our name." The camp's drums resumed, their rhythm weaving through the canyons, a pulse that no bullet could break. Caleb's fingers brushed the swallow beads, their curves echoing the hairpin in his pocket, tying his past to this moment. The Red Hills, once a haunt of ghosts, now cradled a family forged, not in blood, but in courage. He looked to Crow Lance, whose nod carried the weight of shared scars, and to Black Hawk, whose gaze held a father's pride, tempered by the weight of leadership. The warriors rose, their silence shifting to low chants, their voices blending with the stream's rush and the crackle of fires. Caleb stood taller, no longer a shadow, but a spark, his place earned in a world that dealt in grit. The camp settled into a wary calm, the air thick with the scent of sage and roasted meat. Children peered from lodges, their eyes wide but no longer fearful, and women returned to their tasks, casting glances of curiosity rather than scorn. A young warrior, the one who'd nodded at Caleb's silent steps, offered him a strip of dried venison, a small gesture that felt like a bridge. Caleb took it, his hunger sharp, but his heart fuller than it had been since the wagon flames. The Red Elk's world was harsh, its edges honed by loss, but it was a world that saw him, not as a stray, but as kin. As night fell, the canyons darkened, their red walls fading to shadow under a star-strewn sky. Caleb sat by a fire, the beads cool against his chest, listening to the tribe's stories, tales of hunts, of spirits, of battles won and lost. He clutched the hairpin, its swallow shape a quiet promise to his mother that he'd carry her lessons forward. The Red Elk camp was no dream. It was a hard-won home, built on a boy's refusal to let hate win. But beyond the firelight, the hills whispered of Keen's men, still out there, their rifles loaded with vengeance. Caleb's journey as Crow Little Wing had just begun, and the West was in place for rest. Caleb's journey from Dust Creek's Outcast to Crow Little Wing proves mercy can forge a home where hate once ruled. In the harsh West of 1875, his courage bridged divides, showing that even a boy's heart can shift destinies. What stirred you most about Caleb's tale? Did his defiance of loss resonate with you? Share your thoughts below. Your voices keep these stories burning bright. We're grateful for every moment you've spent riding through these wild hills with us. Until the next frontier tale, keep the fire alive and the trails clear. We'll meet again under these vast, star-strewn skies where the West's grit and heart endure.